The following 10 lessons are meant to guide you through reading the novella Animal Farm. Just so that you understand right from the beginning that what I'm going to share with you is not meant to replace a study guide, and it is not a study guide. It does presuppose your thorough interaction with the text, and they are just 10 lessons to lesson guides. They are like lesson guides to help you interpret the novella Animal Farm. A novella is just a short novel. So, firstly, we're going to have to look at what to do when pre-reading Animal Farm. In other words, we first have to do a bit of background research before we start reading. And we need to get ready. So, the first thing you need to do is find yourself a text. You can find it online easily. You can buy it in a second-hand bookstore. It doesn't matter. You can find a hard copy. But find a text and get ready. Find yourself a good study guide with good notes. Once again, there is so much available on the internet and all over that you find yourself a study guide, and most certainly it will be good enough for your purposes. Then you start planning. Think about a system. How are you going to study this novel? Are you going to have a scrapbook where you have colorful displays of who the characters are, how they're related to one another? You follow your own method. In other words, if you're like a visual learner, make it as visual as you like, etc. But you are going to do the studying and you are going to embroider on your knowledge, on the basics that I'm going to talk about. So before reading the book for the first time, as I've mentioned before in aspects of the novel, is make sure that you know about the background information, about genre, what genre are you talking about, what the author intended to share with you. Tell me what the setting is all about. Find out. Look at, whether you can just by skimming perhaps your study guide, look at the themes. The motifs and the symbols that you might have to look out for in the specific book, and start putting together a character list. Very important to make a character list, but use a lot of space because you're going to relate to other characters, you're going to use colors, you're going to fill in information. So just briefly, because this is the first lesson, I'm going to help you along. Let's look at the first aspect, background information. What do you need to know? You actually need to know the full name of the author, at least. You can't say, I'm reading this novel, I'm not quite sure who the author is. You must know the full name. And the author here is commonly known as George Orwell, but it's just really a pen name. It's a pseudonym. His real name was Eric Arthur Blair. He was an English novelist, essayist, journalist. You should know that he did a lot of political writing. Another book that you might have heard about that he wrote is 1984. You might read all those background about the author. Just get some information about the author, because that's also going to help you to understand the book better. So his work is very well known as social criticism. He was opposed to totalitarianism. He also outspokenly rejected democratic socialism. He wrote this book more or less after it came out. It was published just after the Second World War. So you place it more or less in context. So it was published in 1946, and that's going to have some bearing on the book here. And also, you need to know not only the full name of the author, but also the full name of the novel. It is not actually Animal Farm, it is Animal Farm, and the author himself added to that that it's a fairy story. Now, that must certainly have something to do with the book, and we're going to try and figure out what and why he called it a fairy story. As we said already, a novella is just a shortish novel. Now, let us have a look at what the intention of the author was, and you'll also find that in study notes, etc. It is commonly believed that Animal Farm must, on a certain level, be read as being of the genre political satire, right? And that it has allegorical elements. In other words, he speaks about, he's offering a political satire on communism in Russia. Remember, bear in mind when this was published, the idea is that he spoke about the 1917 revolution in London, and in Russia, and how that what happened afterwards, the whole regime of Stalin and what happened there, the totalitarian principles that governed the politics there. So, and that is exactly the time frame. That's exactly when he wrote this book. So we are led to believe that it is a political satire on communism in Russia under the tyrannical rule of Stalin. So, on a certain level, on an allegorical level, and as a political satire, it shows how revolutions can go wrong, and how rapidly the revolutionary ideals can be corrupted and perverted. So that's the one level on which we're going to read the story. The other intention is alerting us. Now, how do we know that? We actually read that between the lines, and I'll explain later. He also wanted to alert us to the qualities and the weaknesses that typify social and political life of human beings in general. Now, note, therefore, that it's not only this political allegory, it is a universal story. It has a universal theme. So, how people, the weaknesses and the qualities in political life, in the political life of human beings, it follows a general trend, and it must be seen in general. And you're going to ask yourself when you finished reading the story, how whatever happened on Animal Farm, how this can happen in any, note well, in any country, in any government, and in any society. So it has this wider intention of being a reflection on these things, right? The themes you'll also find in your guide, and it's those things you need to look out for. But remember, you're in constant interaction with the text, and you're going to think about these things as you go along, and you're going to form your own opinions as you go along. So, as I said, the themes then, it's probably about the corruption of the socialist ideals in the Soviet Union. It is also about man's social tendency towards class stratification, putting groups into classes. It's also about the danger of a naive working class who just follows rules. And a very important theme that you need to look out for, and that I'm going to alert you to, and it's a stylistic thing. It's about the abuse of language as an instrument for power abuse. So, what is this genre? We said it's a political allegory. So, you find the imaginary characters in this book, they satirize real life political events. That is what allegory means. So, we're talking about the revolution that occurred in 1917 in Russia, where the Tsar Romanov, the last Romanov Tsar, was overthrown, and how the ideals of the revolution were totally destroyed and betrayed, totally betrayed by Stalin. Now, the writer himself used the word. He said it's a fairy story. Now, you must be careful. It's most certainly not. There might be something tongue-in-cheek here, there might be something ironic here, but it's not about fairies and things. It's not that. It's more about perhaps the figurative meaning of it being a pack of lies. So that goes with the essence of the book. In other words, how the animals were told or forced or manipulated into believing a big pack of lies. So that virtually also sets the mood. In other words, that we must, and the tone, that we must read the story keeping this in mind. They were telling the animals about this wonderful world, and then they went and betrayed every one of those wonderful principles. But it's also a subgenre of the fairy story, and it's an animal fable, and that just means that animals are used as characters, animal characters, and they make concise, forceful arguments about human morality. Like I told you just now, remember that these animals make statements about human morality, and eventually that is the message of the book, right? And politics. And then, in essence, what it does, it shows how power can corrupt people to exploit the basic goodwill and the basic decency of other people, and very often more simple folk, in order to pursue their own selfish needs. So what is the setting? These are the things. These are the pre-reading activities, remember. It is the manor farm, right? Note how it starts off as an imaginary farm, the manor farm owned by Jones. The name, remember we talked about words that got changed and language that manipulated. It became Animal Farm, and they reverted the name back to Manor Farm in the end when Manor Farm, when the Animal Farm came to represent pretty much what the original Manor Farm represented: tyranny. So, the setting then, it's an imaginary farm, and it is set in England. Now, you might want to say, oh, but why England when it's about the Russian Revolution? Remember, these are all techniques. I told you how this is a universal story, how perhaps Eric Arthur Blair wanted to bring to us attention that this can happen in England. It can happen anywhere, right? He also uses the name Napoleon that has a French ring to it. But can you see how he just sort of plays with the reader and gets the reader to think a little bit, why this name, right? So he brings the events that happened during the Soviet Revolution to the heart of the English countryside. So it's the English countryside. It is set in an unspecified time period, right? That's part of the setting, time and place. And it is largely, I'm saying largely, free from historical references. Actually, no overt historic references. There are 2 instances, though, in the book that actually bring us to, it's the mention, the time of the Battle of the Cowshed, for instance. There are two things that actually remind us that his intention was also to satirize the revolution and what went with it, but it's not done overtly. So it is largely free from historical references. Why? Because this is a universal story. And it but it is generally assumed, as I've told you before, that Orwell means the fable to be contemporaneous with the object of his satire, which is the Russian Revolution that started in 1917 and the aftermath, more or less, up to 1945. But remember, as you read always, that the significance of the story's action is not limited to a time, it is immediate. Things happen to the animals there and then, right? It's immediate and it's ongoing rather than historical. The symbols that you need to look out for, you will have noticed that the motifs, which are the recurring structures, in the book, they will be songs, there'll be poems, there'll be slogans, serving as propaganda tools. Can you see that all these things are verbal? It has to do with language. Take note of that. And it serves as propaganda tools to manipulate, right? You'll find things like state ritual, military awards, large parades, and all these things are signs. In the same way as language is a sign of something, these things become signs within the book. New songs, the changing of songs, for instance, the firing of the gun, these are motifs running through the book, and they are signs. Just like the language and the changing and the manipulation through language occur throughout as signs of something else. There are also symbols to look out for, characters, figures, colors representing abstract concepts. See if you can figure out as you go along what these things represent. What does Animal Farm as a symbol represent? The flag, the sheep, and what happens to the sheep, the 7 commandments, the barn, the windmill, old Major's skull that gets exhibited, dug up and exhibited, all these things. What do they represent? And remember, I said you start putting together for yourself a character list. Very often in contextual essay questions, you are given questions that revolve around characters and characterizations. So compile your list of characters. Make sure you know who this character is, what his qualities are, what are his characteristics, who does he represent in terms of allegory. Just make a note of it. And then also how the character changes throughout the novel. And you're going to leave space for that. You're going to color it in. You're going to embroider on your information while you build on your character list. It's very important. And also how the characters interact with one another, what they say about each other, and the significance of it, right? So add more information, references, and quotes as you progress with your studies. Small, pertinent little quotes. For instance, what are the 2 slogans that Napoleon adopted? Write them down. I will work harder. Not Napoleon, sorry, a boxer. That a boxer adopts. And Napoleon is always right, and I will work harder. Just you make little notes of these things as you carry on. Since this is an allegory, like I said, also find the historical figure, write out that name. For instance, Mr. Jones is the owner of Manor Farm at the beginning, right? And he is a very inconsiderate master. He doesn't look after the animals. He's often lazy. He's often drunk. Be careful not to become too literal when you make these connections. So, oh, I know. He stood for Tsar Nicholas II. So Tsar Nicholas was always drunk. That's not not the point. He was just not there. He wasn't there when he was supposed to feed them. He was not a good leader, etc. So be careful. Don't become too literal, but know what things stand for. Now, you don't really read so much background unless you want to. However, if you do, it is just so interesting, right? Getting this a bit more information about the actual characters. We said that Tsar Nicholas Romanov stands for Mr. Jones, the manor farm owner. Go and read about the Romanov family, because it's actually about what happens before the events in Animal Farm, right? They get thrown off their own farm. He gets thrown off his own throne, and things happen to this family. Very interesting things. I'm going to leave it to you to go and read about. It's it's alluring. I just love reading about these things, and you might come across the name of Anastasia, the little girl. And later on, a certain Anastasia girls claimed to be the Anastasia when they were all killed in front of a firing squad. They were all, acid was thrown over them. But she claims that she survived, and there were actually there was a two-part film made on that as well. You may come across the idea that this little heir was a hemophiliac, and he was a constant bleeder, and you'll get to know some interesting aspects of the wife and her relationship with Rara Rasputin, and it's just very interesting to do, although it's not crucial to the story, but it just places it into a context which is alluring. So also one representing the other, Old Major, the boar, who is a spokesperson for the animals, is like a combination of Lenin and Marx. Go and read about what they stood for, etc. Read about the history of the time, where in the 1890s there was a series of bad harvests, there was starvation, and there was unrest amongst the peasants. The peasants, of course, being the animals, the general common animals. Discontent amongst the rising middle class. About the Bolsheviks, who under Lenin became a strong political force. This is Lenin. And then in 1905, that's more or less where Animal Farm starts, right? Where thousands of workers march on the Tsar's palace. And then, of course, we get in October 1917, we get the Russian Revolution, where Trotsky helps Lenin plan the takeover, where there's a bloody struggle, there's a civil war, and the Bolsheviks seize control of Petrograd, and they overthrow the Russian government, and they establish, and that's important, the communist rule. And of course, in terms of the communism and animalism, those two things are related, right? So do as much background reading as you can. It just makes it so much more interesting. And then before you sit down for the next lesson, make sure that you have done the following. I've already told you, get everything together. So all the pre-reading exercises that I've just spoken about, background, full name, allegory, etc., all those things, make sure you've done that. You read the entire book, please, keeping these things in mind, and you think about aspects and get your initial thoughts going. And of course, use your study guide, fill in your information, start putting your own notes together. And then next time, I want you to then reread Remember, that's the next step, is to reread chapter 1 and paying close attention to the aspects of structure and style that I referred to in the 2 lessons on the aspects of the novel, in 8.1 and 8.2. And then we're going to look at that in the next lesson on Animal Farm.